Dave Talliver, and on behalf of the members and staff of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University, I would like to welcome you to Fall for the Book 2020. These free online events run from September through November, and you can find the full schedule at Fall for the Book, that's all one word, fallforthebook.org. Also, be sure to follow us on Crowdcast. You can do that by clicking the Fall for the Book icon above this window and then clicking follow. And of course, during today's presentation, please enter any questions you have in the chat window that you see on your screen. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce the historian, Dr. David Marwell, who will speak to us today about his recently published book entitled Mengele, Unmasking the Angel of Death. David received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Brandeis University and a PhD in Modern European History from Binghamton University. During his professional career, he has held many and varied positions, including Executive Director of the Assassination Records Review Board, Director of the Berlin Documentation Center, and Chief of Investigative Research for the United States Department of Justice Office of Special Investigations, where he was responsible for conducting both historical and forensic research in support of the investigations of Nazi-era war criminals. That now takes us to the subject of today's book, and so I would like now to welcome Dr. David Marwell. Sir.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks very much for that kind introduction. The coronavirus pandemic has presented many challenges for authors trying to promote their books. And my timing was perfect. My book was published at the end of January, coinciding with the beginning of this horrible pandemic. And that's why I'm very grateful to Fall for the Book for giving me the opportunity to talk about mine with all of you today. I'm immensely pleased, and I will confess also a bit relieved that so far it has enjoyed a very positive response with good reviews in respected publications and wonderful feedback from readers. Although I could talk about the book until breakfast tomorrow morning, the organizers of this program have wisely limited my time. So I thought I would provide a brief introduction to the book by explaining its origin, telling you something about the sources upon which it is based, summarizing what I found and what I found that is new, and by reading a few excerpts, perhaps, if we have some time. I also want to allow enough time for questions. I found that people who listen to my presentation often have a lot of questions, and I'd be happy to answer them. Although I've been thinking about this book for a very long time, I can date its origin precisely. In the fall of 2015, I had decided to step down as director of the Museum of Jewish Heritage in Lower Manhattan, New York City, after having led that institution for 15 years. James Barron, a reporter for the New York Times, learned of my decision and during an interview asked me what my plans were. I blurted out without much thought that I was going to write a book about Joseph Mengele. When I read the next day about my plans in the New York Times, I felt duty-bound to follow through, lest the Times be accused of fake news. Mengele has emerged as an iconic symbol of the Holocaust. Indeed, Mengele has come for many to represent not only the Holocaust, but also the failure of justice at the end of World War II, which saw so many Nazi criminals escape any kind of reckoning. He is also seen as the exemplar for science gone mad. When I started work on the book 4 years ago, I set up a Google alert so that I would be notified each time Mengele was mentioned on the internet. And since then, I have received messages nearly every day, and most days, multiple indications that Mengele's name had been invoked, sometimes as a historical figure, but just as often as the benchmark for evil, as a malign metaphor. Since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, the incidence of his mention on the internet or in some foreign press article or somewhere on the internet has increased significantly. Most days I receive 5 or 6 indications that he's been mentioned, mostly inaccurately, but also as a kind of benchmark. If you're talking about a bad doctor at a hospital, they'll say this is the Mengele of the hospital, or this is the Mengele of that particular organization. The more Mengele has become a symbol, however, the more obscure he has become as a human being, as a man. And my book attempts to strip away some of the myth that has attached itself to Mengele and that has served to elevate him to an iconic role. And at the same time, the book seeks to replace what is a frightening caricature of a man with an even more unsettling picture of the human being that he was. Beginning in 1980, I served as a historian for the US Department of Justice Office of Special Investigations, the War Crimes Unit, where I conducted research in support of US prosecutions of Nazi war criminals living in the United States. In 1985, I was assigned to the investigation of Joseph Mengele with the goal of discovering if and how he might have been used or assisted by the United States, and finally, to find him and to bring him to justice. This investigation was soon joined by 2 and then 3 international partners, with the Israelis and Germans coming on board in early 1985 and the Brazilians in the summer of 1985, after a body thought to be that of Joseph Mengele was discovered in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Now, I originally set out to write about my experience with this investigation, but in the end, my plans changed. Instead of restricting myself to writing solely about the investigation, I expanded my effort into a biography of Mengele. I had discovered a rich body of newly released records and brilliant new scholarship, both of which shed light on areas of Mengele's life and career that had been unknown to me and which became available only after I had started writing. The book is based on records which I found in archives in Germany, Israel, and the United States. I used the once top secret CIA file on Mengele, which was released and declassified in 2000, and the secret Mossad report, declassified and released only in 2017. The book is based on interviews with participants and on my own recollection of events in which I participated. It is also based on Mengele's own writings, including diaries discovered after his death, and especially an autobiographical treatment, which he chose to write in the form of a novel, which freed him from the bounds of literal truth and allowed him to use literary devices to tell the story of his life. I begin the book by describing Mengele's childhood and admit to finding no hint there of the man he was later to become. There are no stories of him torturing pet cats in the backyard or anything that would have revealed the murderer that he became. I describe Mengele's education, which, surprising to many, included 2 PhDs, one in medicine and one in anthropology. I talk about the inspirational teaching that he received from Nobel Prize laureates, some who had been awarded the prize before they taught him and some that were awarded the Nobel Prize later. I talk about Mengele's early promise as a scientist and the fact that he published in respected journals. He published book reviews and research articles. And I found even that his medical dissertation was actually cited as late as the 1970s in a medical journal. I talk about his having received a position at a leading university institute in Frankfurt, Germany. I explain how his fields of study, medicine and anthropology, would enjoy an elevated status under the Nazis, who came to power just as he was beginning his studies. Heinrich Himmler once said that National Socialism was applied biology, and the very science that Mengele pursued enjoyed, in the words of one scholar, a symbiotic relationship with the Nazi state. I explain how the role of the physician underwent a transformation under the Nazis, where the so-called racial community, the Volksgemeinschaft, was substituted for the individual as the focus of care. Nazi physicians could, in an intellectual and moral sleight of hand, remain faithful in their own minds to their Hippocratic oaths and engage in Nazi racial and eugenic activity simply by substituting the perceived welfare of the people, of the race, of the folk, for that of the individual patient. I explain how Mengele was professionally engaged in so-called racial hygiene by delivering professional opinions about the race of individuals in criminal cases. The Nazis placed on their criminal in the criminal code a special crime, that is the crime of racial, in German it's Rassenschande, racial shame, sometimes translated as racial defilement, where if a non-Jewish man or woman, an Aryan, had sexual relations with a non-Jew, they would be guilty of a criminal act and could be sentenced to prison. In some cases, an individual who was charged with a Jewish man charged with racial defilement, if he had sexual relations with a German woman, would have been brought up on charges. In some cases, the defense against these charges was that, well, I'm not really a Jew. Although my parents were Jews, my mother actually had an affair with an Aryan man, so I'm only half Jew, which will shield me from the criminal charges. And so Mengele was brought in, and his colleagues were brought in to do these racial evaluations of these individuals to determine whether they were Jewish or not. And this was done through a careful, in their sense, careful evaluation of their physical features to determine whether they were actually Jews or not. I supply an important corrective in my book to past biographies of Mengele by explaining his wartime experience as a frontline soldier with the SS Viking Division, which saw him exposed to combat and extreme violence from the very beginning of the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 in June until the retreat from Stalingrad 18 months later. I devote an entire part of the book to Mengele's time at Auschwitz, the concentration and death camp located in occupied Poland, actually, which had become part of Germany at the time. And I described Mengele's duties, which included care, such as it was, of the inmate population, not out of concern for their well-being, but as a public health issue in their view, in order to protect the German staff from any epidemics that might develop within the inmate population. Mengele was quite famous, actually, for having devised a rather efficient, if grotesquely brutal, solution to an epidemic that he encountered in the Auschwitz camp shortly after he arrived. He took one of the barracks, he emptied it of all of the inmates, sent them to the gas chambers, then took the residents of another barracks and completely deloused them and fumigated their clothing, making sure that they were no longer infested with the lice that caused the epidemic, and moved them into what had been a cleaned out barracks, and then did this in a shuffling, systematic way all the way down to the last barrack in the camp, thereby ridding the camp of the epidemic, sacrificing the 1,500 Jews who were residents in the first barracks, not thinking perhaps they might have erected tents or some other way that they could have accomplished the same result. Mengele is probably most infamous for his activity as a physician at Auschwitz, where he carried out selections on the ramp at Auschwitz. The trains bringing Jews from all corners of Europe would arrive at the ramp at Auschwitz. The Jews would be taken out of the rail cars, and they would have to march past one of the physicians of the camp. And Mengele took his position on the ramp to make these selections in a routine fashion. There was a rotation, and he would take his position. And the Jews would come forward, and he would look at them, and he would determine whether, with a quick look, whether they were capable of being exploited for labor before being killed, or whether they were either too old or too infirm and should be killed right away. So that he had, during his time at Auschwitz, he probably encountered several 100,000 Jews and made this split-second decision about their immediate fate. He did this by tearing families apart and defining the dark fate for the people whom he confronted. Perhaps also, and perhaps the issue that's made him the most responsible for making the iconic figure that he became was his pursuit of his scientific interests at Auschwitz. He took advantage of his position there to create, in a sense, a research institute patterned on the one that he had been employed before the war. Not only did potential subjects of scientific research arrive at Auschwitz in the tens of thousands, but also there arrived potential scientific colleagues, people whom he could employ, recruit to assist him in his research. So on the ramp at Auschwitz, before deciding which Jews should be sent directly to the gas chambers and which should be exploited first for their labor, he called out if there were any physicians, any medical illustrators, any nurses, any anthropologists, any person who possessed some scientific knowledge and experience, whom he could then force to assist him in the research that he wanted to conduct there. And he found, and will surprise no one, that among the hundreds of thousands of Jews who were deported to Auschwitz, among them were a large number of extremely talented, very well trained, in some cases quite famous physicians, pediatricians, ophthalmologists, and also many anthropologists and many technicians who could assist him. He identified these people and then employed them. They had no choice to assist him in his research. And one of the problems with looking at Mengele's research is we have very, very little concrete documentation that describes it. We only have, with some very few exceptions, the testimony of individuals who were subjected to the experiments that he conducted there. And we have the testimony of the inmate physicians and inmate scientists who assisted him. This testimony is, by its very nature, not always so reliable. In the case of the subjects of experimentation, they were often children, often traumatized, and often, although they understood what Mengele did to them, they could testify about what happened to them. They couldn't testify about the reasons for the experiments. They couldn't give the context for them. They couldn't explain what Mengele's goals were. So we're forced to kind of reconstruct the science that Mengele was attempting to conduct at Auschwitz through spotty documentation and through the testimony of some of the inmate physicians who were forced to work with him. We also have a few records that survived from the institute with which he was associated in Berlin, the so-called Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. And we're able to understand the different areas that occupied his research interest, which I talk about and spend some time describing in the book. And I won't repeat them now, but I think everyone understands that Mengele had a significant interest in twins and twin research. This was not because of some kind of grotesque fascination with twins, as many people allege. And it wasn't because he was interested in trying to discover the secret of twin births so that he could help to increase the birth rate in Germany to kind of secure an Aryan future, which is often cited as the reason why he was interested in twins. That explanation ignores the fact that twin research was considered, even in the United States, as the gold standard for genetic research. If you have two people, if they're identical twins, they have the identical or nearly identical genetic material, and you determine that particular pathology exists in both members of this twin pair, then you can posit that the particular pathology is related to genetics. If you have fraternal twins who have the same or the same genetic, their respective genetic makeups would be the same as two siblings. So they don't share the identical genetic makeup, but they share the identical or nearly identical environment. They had the same environment within their mother's womb. They had the same family conditions, the same kind of nutrition. So that if you compare the existence of certain pathologies within identical twins and within fraternal twins, you can make some conclusions about the nature of that particular disease or condition or characteristic. And that's the reason why twins were so important for Mengele's research. If you think if he was really looking for the secret of twin births, he would be more interested in the twins' parents than in the twins themselves, because the twins would have had presumably might have had been useful in determining the conditions through which twin births were possible.
David, if I could interrupt for a moment,
yeah,
do you think you could talk a bit about the, I guess, the twisted path that Mengele took at the end of World War II to finally end up where he did?
Sure. Yeah, and I think that's a good idea in order for me to get through this introduction in time to get some questions. Mengele left Auschwitz in the just near the end of its existence. Auschwitz was liberated by the Red Army in the Soviets in January of 1945, and Mengele left the camp a week or so before the Soviets liberated it, and he went and was assigned to another concentration camp called Gross Rosen near Breslau, and he remained at that camp until it was then also liberated. And by the end of the war, he found himself, he was able to connect with a German army field hospital that he encountered on his way back toward Germany. And he recognized a fellow a classmate from medical school among this field hospital, and he joined that field hospital. He shed his SS uniform and donned a German army uniform, and was able to develop a cogent cover story, and eventually was taken prisoner along with that field hospital by the Americans in Bavaria. And he was in one prisoner of war camp and then sent to another one, and eventually released, maybe under his own name. It's unclear entirely. There were a couple of reasons why he was able to be released without suspicion. First of all, although Mengele's name appeared on some wanted lists at the end of the war, those wanted lists were poorly distributed, and the camps where he had been interned did not identify him as a war criminal. But the most important reason why he escaped detention was that he didn't have under his left arm the very important, at least for investigative purposes, blood type tattoo that every SS man was supposed to have. He did not have that telltale marker. The SS would tattoo the blood type under the arm the same way that the US Army would print or emboss the blood type on the dog tags of American soldiers. So in case a soldier was wounded and they needed a blood transfusion, and was unconscious, then the treating physician would know what blood type he had. Mengele did not have the blood type tattoo. And so he escaped the most effective litmus test for determining whether someone was an SS man or not. The US at the POW camps would say, take off your shirts. People would parade past the examiner with their arms raised. If they had the blood type tattoo, they would be shunted aside and then interrogated and given more intense focus. Mengele did not have this, and he was released. He made his way to a farm in Bavaria where he lived under an assumed name for about 4 years before he escaped to South America. Unlike many of the suspicions that people had, he was not assisted by the US. He was not part of the so-called rat line, which was established to take Nazi war criminals and also security suspects out of Europe through Italian ports to South America. He made his way by himself, but he had a very important advantage. That was that he came from a very wealthy family that had a lot of money, and they were able to purchase the assistance of a whole cadre of people who were assisting Nazis to escape through the Brenner Pass into Italy, down to Genoa, and by ship to Argentina, where he arrived in 1949 and lived there for about 10 years without any concern, any justified concern for his safety. He, of course, was concerned about being captured, but he didn't need to be because no one was looking for him. He built a relatively successful life in Argentina, eventually was able, with the help of family funds, to invest in a pharmaceutical company, then divorced his first wife, who didn't come to Europe with him, and then married his second wife and had a stepson, and felt safe enough, in fact, to give up his false identity in 1956 and take on his real name. He went to the German embassy and said, "Look, I'm not this man named Helmut Greger, whom I said I was. I'm Joseph Mengele." And without any suspicion, he was given a German passport. He visited Europe and his home one time in 1956. And he looked forward to a rather secure and prosperous future in Argentina until the summer of 1958, when he learned from his family in Germany that some investigators were beginning to ask questions about him. And there was investigative interest by German legal authorities in Joseph Mengele. He immediately decided he had to find another place to stay, could no longer remain in Argentina, and he made his way to Paraguay, where he established and was able to gain naturalized citizenship through fraud, but he was able to become a citizen of Paraguay, and he felt that this would protect him because Paraguay would not extradite citizens of their country, and as a naturalized citizen, he would be safe from any kind of legal attempt to extradite him to Germany to stand trial. Then the Israelis captured Adolf Eichmann in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. And Mengele learned that there was no place safe for him. He could be safe from any legal attempt by Germany to extradite him or some other country to extradite him, but he couldn't be safe from the Israeli Secret Service, who could, as they proved they could, find him and take him back for trial in Israel. So Mengele left Argentina in 1960, probably in October or so, and he went to Brazil, where he took on, he left his name, which was Jose Mengele, and left it behind in Paraguay and became a number of different identities in Brazil. And he was protected by a family, several families in Brazil, and also received assistance from some emigre German organizations that helped him find a secure hideout. And of course, he had the support of his family that supplied significant funds to secure his existence in Brazil. And he remained there until 1979, when he went on vacation to the coast in Brazil and was swimming and had a stroke and either died from the stroke or died from drowning as a result of the stroke. His body was then buried under an assumed name in a graveyard in São Paulo. And although we started our investigation in 1985, not knowing he had been dead for 6 years, the family never revealed the fact that Mengele had died. And it was through the work of the German police, who searched the home of a family friend in Mengele's hometown, and discovered some correspondence which led them to believe that he might have been in Argentina, in Paraguay, in Brazil. And we all went down to Brazil to investigate. The body was exhumed, and then began a long and complicated forensic investigation to determine whether the body that was found there was actually Mengele's. And I think maybe I can, Dave, if you think this is a good place to stop and start with questions, or
well, we do have a few audience questions here,
yeah.
if you wish. The first audience question was, besides Mengele, who do you think is the most prominent Nazi to evade capture by the West?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know how I'd rank them. There were certainly legions of them that escaped capture. Alois Brunner, who ended up in Syria. There were a number of people who escaped, and it's anyone's. I can't really pick the most notorious. There were just so many of them. It was really a significant failure of justice.
Okay. I was interested in the book after I read it, that you did some extensive covering of the different approaches and the motivations of the three governments, the German, Israeli, and United States government, in the final search for Mengele. Could you elaborate on some of those differences and the motivations for our audience?
Sure. As I mentioned, we began the investigation at the beginning of 1985, and the Germans joined us quickly, and so did the Israelis. The Germans, although they had over the years followed up on leads and leads that came over the transom saying, well, Mengele is in this place or that place, they would follow up on these things, but they never conducted a kind of active, effective investigation. Of course, they would, when Mengele's father died, they staked out his funeral, believing that Mengele would return. When Mengele's brother died, they staked out his funeral. They did those kinds of things, but in terms of a kind of systematic attempt to locate him, they really failed at that. And it was a monumental task. But still, I think one of the things that motivated them in joining the investigation with us was a kind of compensatory effort to make up for past inaction. And the people that I worked with on the German side, the German prosecutors and police officers, were extremely dedicated and quite talented. And they worked, I can't fault them in terms of the effort that they expended when we joined with them, but I certainly know that they could have done much more, and if they had had the political will to do so throughout the years that Mengele was hiding in South America. The Israelis joined, and I think their motivation is quite clear. Their conduct in the investigation and their what for me was quite surprising is their reluctance to close the case. I talked about this complicated forensic investigation. There was a suspicion that Mengele might have been carrying out a major hoax on all of us by having found someone who the body that was found in the grave in São Paulo in the summer of 1985 was only almost entirely or exclusively skeletonized remains. There was no soft tissue left, so there were no fingerprints. there was some hair and of course his clothing, but the rest were just his skeletonized remains that had been in a kind of wet environment, and so they were in very bad shape. And 1985 was before DNA became a useful and effective forensic tool. So the only way to really identify a body was to compare what the dental records, what the dental evidence that existed, and what other evidence that the bones could reveal. You compare that evidence with what we knew about the living Mengele. So there was no conclusive way of doing it. There were no fingerprints, and the Israelis were quite concerned that Mengele might have carried out a major hoax, that he had somehow manipulated the evidence so that the people who discovered the body would believe it was he. And they had reason to believe that. Mengele was an anthropologist and a physician. He had the means and opportunity. He had a lot of time. He could have perhaps have found a body that would have matched his in all of the identifiable ways that could have been determined by the forensic examination. So the Israelis didn't want to close the case. The Germans were absolutely certain it was Mengele from the very beginning for a number of reasons. They had a very dramatic and effective test where they compared the skull with photographs of Mengele, and they had they didn't believe in the notion of a hoax, and the Israelis were just reluctant to close the case. So although a preliminary finding was made in the summer of 1985, end of June, the case wasn't closed by the Germans, and it wasn't closed by the Israelis. And although we in the United States had technically accepted the preliminary report by the American team, we actually kept the case open and continued to investigate. And the reason was that there was significant amount of new evidence that had been found when the body was found, and that had not been evaluated. So we actually worked for another several years on the case, and all along, and we were really motivated by the Israelis' refusal to close the case. And because the Israelis wouldn't give their imprimatur to a closed case, the Germans wouldn't either, because the Germans believed, I think rightly, that no one would believe them if they said Joseph Mengele's body had been found, if the Israelis said that they were skeptical. So the case went on, and it really waited until 1990, when the use of DNA as a forensic tool, the science behind it had developed to the point where it was used on the skeletonized remains, and a conclusive answer could be found. And the case was finally closed in April of 1992, after all of the DNA evidence had been secured. And at that time, the Israelis closed the case, although they were still skeptical, I must say, even at the end. And I think part of that was because of part of it was a political decision. Part of it was the Israelis had conducted very effective, well, not so effective, but very energetic efforts to find Mengele over the years. And they had been outwitted by him all along. And I think that they wanted to be 120% certain that the body was his, and that prevented them from closing the case. And also there was a kind of emotional factor in that Mengele, who was so monstrous and so kind of greater than so outsized in his impact and his reputation, the fact that he could have died an old man's death, and without having to confront his accusers or his victims, um, that there was a kind of emotional reaction against believing that he was gone, that he was dead.
Okay, I have another audience question. Actually, is it true that Argentina welcomed a lot of Nazis after the war?
Yes, it is true. There was under Juan Perón, Argentina was a kind of very benign place for Nazis to live and to congregate. And when Mengele arrived there, he had been on this farm as a farmhand in Germany for 4 years and doing heavy manual work, and was really quite relieved to be in Argentina, where he was relieved of the boredom and the challenge of heavy physical labor. He could once again kind of feed his own interests. Argentina, but Buenos Aires was a very lively city with theaters and bookstores and libraries, and there was a large and quite active emigre community, and Mengele joined in that community. Many ex-Nazis were there. Eichmann was there, and he felt comfortable and safe and secure. Now, when Juan Perón left the scene in 1955, it was no longer such a hospitable place to be, and so things were changing for Mengele, and that was the kind of the beginning of the end of his kind of happy existence in Argentina. And Paraguay at the time, of course, had Alfredo Stroessner as its head, and he was quite comfortable with accepting and promoting the residence of Nazis within Paraguay.
Okay, I have another question here. What is the reason he did not have the tattoo, such that identification would have been possible after the war, as was with others?
Yeah, so we found
speculate on that.
Yeah, well, we found in our investigation that although one assumed that this practice of universal tattooing of SS members was a consistent practice, we found that it wasn't actually. I found records that were a survey of POWs, people who were in fact in the SS. Some, not huge percentage, but some significant percentage did not have the tattoo. The other explanation is, one, that it wasn't a universal practice, and number two, Mengele was, according to his wife, whom we interviewed, was quite vain, his first wife, and quite fastidious about his appearance. And as the medical officer of his unit, he was responsible for actually having the tattoos applied to his troops, and he simply decided not to have one. And it's clear that he didn't have it, at least from the testimony of the wife. And I think that's the explanation.
Okay, another listener here also asked, why do you think Mengele kept diaries and wrote a book that sounds to be semi-autobiographical?
So he was, Mengele is sometimes difficult for people to hear this, but he was an intellectual. I mean, he read widely, was interested in ideas, and he was also cut off from his family and his homeland, and the diaries, and the notebooks and the kind of musings that he recorded, I think were a way of just him expressing himself. He wrote the autobiography for his family, and it was written as a novel because he wanted to be able to use the kind of raw material of his life, and he wanted to kind of elevate it in a way to make it make important points, and he felt that if he had to strictly relate the actual facts of his life, he would be less able to make the points he wanted to make. So he used literary devices where he could displace his own motives onto other people. He could generalize certain things. It just made it easier for him to communicate what he wanted to communicate to his family. So he never intended to publish this as a book, and he never really completed it. At least we never were able to find any material about his time at Auschwitz. That was not covered in this autobiographical effort that he undertook. He talks about his birth. He spends 100 pages talking about his birth. He talks about his schooling. He talks about his life on the farm. He talks about his escape to South America, and he doesn't really talk about his life in South America in this autobiography.
Okay, and I guess in the interest of time, since this is going so quickly, I'd like to ask one final question, and
Sure.
this is a bit of speculation on your part. Could you share any thoughts on how the final results of the Josef Mengele investigation may have brought a measure of closure for his wartime victims and their families?
So I would have liked to think that it would have brought closure, and the same way that I talked about how the Israeli government refused to close the case. My experience with the survivor community was that they were unwilling to accept that he was actually dead. That the most outspoken person within the survivor community was a woman. She died last year, named Eva Kor. And Eva Kor had been one of Mengele's twin subjects of experiments. And she, to the day she died, I believe, did not accept the findings that Mengele had died. It was too difficult emotionally for her to have accepted that. So she didn't receive the closure that I had hoped she would have. And so I don't know. I think Robert Lifton, who wrote a book about Nazi doctors, said that the inability to actually confront Mengele, the notion that he somehow slipped away without having to face his victims was too difficult a prospect to accept. And so for many survivors, there really was no closure. For the survivors who had, a kind of deeply personal connection to Mengele, for whom Mengele played such a terrible part of their lives.
Well, with that, I think it's probably we've reached a good juncture here. In addition to thanking you, David, for your appearing with us today, I'd like to thank the staff of the Fall for the Book at George Mason University for helping us present this today. And I'd like to recommend to the entire audience to please secure a copy of this book. I myself have read the book. I found it an extremely compelling read. It was, to borrow a hackneyed phrase, it was a page turner. Even though I sort of knew the end of the story, it was interesting to hear the story. I couldn't recommend this highly enough to anyone. I mean, so please buy the book. And again, David, thank you so much for your time today, and best of luck with your book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.